sure before I answer that question. I just don't want to tell you the wrong thing, that's all. Yeah. But we're going to go basic. I'm going to try to factor in a little bit of time to do something like you. My gut tells me no, it's not cumulative, but I want to be sure. So thank you. But speaking of class, and speaking of these exams, even though we are a week behind in terms of the Blackboard structure, we have plenty of time. We're in good shape. But it does mean that we need to be proactive about covering the material so that we don't get further behind, right? This week, we're talking about epistemology. So we're making a little bit of a turn. We're taking a little turn in our discussion. Up to this point, we've been talking about logic, pure logic. And we talked about two forms of logic. There's formal and informal. Last week, and the topic of the quiz today was all about informal logic fallacies. There were two examples of formal fallacies, and that's about as far as we're going to take this, because formal and informal fallacies are kind of like problems with math. Formal logic resembles algebra more closely than it does traditional philosophy, which is why we're not focusing on formal logic in this course. I'm not going to have you guys do truth tables. I'm not going to have you guys work out these formal issues with the structure of logical arguments. You're welcome. Instead, we're going to focus on informal fallacies, which are far more commonly deployed in conversation. And that's what you're going to be confronting, both in your own reasoning as well as in debating with other people. And whether those debates be formal debates or whether they be just sort of casual conversations. Informal fallacies are good for us to know, to help ourselves not make those errors and also to identify them in the errors, identify them in the statements that other people make. But in this week, we're making the transition to epistemology, which is a big, kind of crazy sounding word. It's in many ways a very beautiful word. What is knowledge is the question that epistemology attempts to get at. What is knowledge? Is there a limit to what we can know? How can we increase our knowledge if we don't know what knowledge is, fundamentally? Epistemology is the field within philosophy that focuses on questions pertaining to the nature and extent of human knowledge. I mean, what is knowledge exactly? How can we know it? And what is the extent of it? How much can we know? The word comes from the Greek episteme, which means knowledge, and logos, which is the study of, or the explanation of. Epistemology focuses on what knowledge is, as well as what types of knowledge there are. And we gotta, I think we understand this intuitively. There are different kinds of knowledge. We're going to discuss some of those as we go along. Because knowledge is complex, epistemology also includes the study of the possibility of justification, the sources and nature of justification, the sources of belief, and the nature of truth. So home in for just a second on those three words: justification, belief, and truth. We're going to talk a lot about those three words as we go along. In fact, justified true belief, you will find to be the foundation of epistemology, of knowledge, for over 2,000 years until we get to the 1960s. This is a statue, I just have to mention this briefly, and you see down here written the word episteme in Greek, right? This is one of the great statues at the Library of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. I'd love to go there. How do we do epistemology in philosophy? Well, like other areas, epistemology begins with the philosophical method of doubting and asking questions. What we're doing right now is asking important questions about the nature of knowledge. What is knowledge exactly? How much can we know? Right? These are questions, and as we raise these questions, we begin to investigate and clarify what we mean. And in doing so, we get closer to the truth, which is one of the conditions of knowledge. It's a bit circular kind of way. We'll talk about that too. What if everything we think we know is false? Can we be sure of the truth of our beliefs? What does it even mean for a belief to be true? Philosophers ask questions about the nature and possibility of knowledge and related concepts, and then craft possible answers. But because of the nature of philosophic investigation, simply offering answers is not enough. Philosophers also try to identify the problem with their answers and formulate possible solutions to those problems and look for counter-arguments. The tools that we use in epistemology are arguments, conceptual analysis, counterexamples, and research. That's important. So if you were a philosopher and you were inclined to get at the question of what is knowledge, what extent of knowledge we're able to obtain, and the nature of knowledge itself, then you could use these tools, things like counterexample, of argumentation, thought experiment, conceptual analysis, and research. Aristotle is where we get this definition of knowledge as justified true belief, or JTB. We're going to see this also in Plato's work. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. Okay. One of the main questions within epistemology pertains to the nature of the concepts of knowledge, justification of truth. Analyzing what concepts means is the practice of conceptual analysis. I'm not trying to trick anyone. This sounds like a definition that's so straightforward that it stares you in the face. But conceptual analysis literally is analyzing concepts. What are concepts? Which concepts do we use to build our definitions, and do they work? Right? So it's not enough for us to take definitions at face value. We have to also examine the concepts behind the definitions. Does that make sense? Analyzing what concepts mean is the practice of conceptual analysis. The idea is that we can answer questions like, what is knowledge and what is truth, by using our grasp of relevant concepts. When investigating a concept, theorists attempt to identify the essential features of the concept or its necessary conditions. So when investigating knowledge, theorists work to identify features that all instances of knowledge share. But researchers are not only interested in isolating necessary conditions for concepts such as knowledge, they also want to determine what set of conditions, when taken together, always amounts to knowledge, that is, sufficient conditions. Conceptual analysis is an important element doing philosophy, especially epistemology. So let me parse out the distinction between necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. As described here, this comes straight from the reading for this week. Necessary conditions are essential features of a concept that all instances of knowledge share. We're talking about knowledge. But just because something is necessary to knowledge does not mean that by itself it is sufficient for knowledge. Okay, let me make it even clearer. To pass this class, or any class at Life University, it's necessary that you take the final exam. Would you say? Would you agree? Okay. But taking the final exam by itself is not sufficient for passing the class. Does that make sense? Well, now you ought to immediately understand the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is something that is essential, but maybe by itself is not sufficient. Okay? If you're going to really describe something, you're also going to have to describe everything that attaches to it that becomes sufficient for the thing. So if we're talking about knowledge, yeah, maybe believing in what you're talking about is necessary, but believing in something by itself doesn't count as knowledge. Does that make sense? So what are the necessary conditions of knowledge? Well, we've already mentioned three. Justification, and we're going to define these in a little more detail as we go. Justification, truth, and belief. These are necessary, but maybe taken all together, they could be considered sufficient as well. Any one of them by themselves is necessary for knowledge, sure, but by themselves is not sufficient. You have to have all of them together to have knowledge. Does that make sense?
But what about all the things that are left out?
That's a great question. And we're going to confront that directly when we talk about Gettier later on. So hang on to that. That's an excellent question. Let's talk about counterexamples and thought experiments. Now I have a picture of Einstein here because he was one of the world's greatest thought experimenters. He had this uncanny knack of being able to imagine different possibilities, to use his imagination to construct sort of mental experiments and run them through to see how they would ultimately unfold. And from that, to be able to determine things about the world that others couldn't see. So he came up with all these elaborate thought experiments that guided his thinking and inspired his mathematics. He was a master at thought experiment. Counterexamples to definitions in epistemology take the form of hypothetical cases or thought experiments. intended to show that a definition includes features that are either not necessary or not sufficient for the concept. So like, let's say we're putting forward a definition of knowledge, and we're going to say something like, well, knowledge is justified true belief. Well, if you're a philosopher doing epistemology, then you might try to imagine a thought experiment where some kind of knowledge exists that it entails justification, truth, and belief, but needs something else, let's say. An example that shows that those three, justified true belief, are necessary but insufficient on their own. And we're going to look at an example that I just mentioned. Hermann Gettier did just that in the 1960s. Pretty amazing. If counterexamples work to defeat an analysis, then theorists will amend the analysis. That means they'll come up with something else, offer maybe a new definition, and start the process over again. So it's very much like science. If I perform an experiment to try to either refute or affirm some observation I made about the world, others ought to be able to reproduce the same experiment and get the same results, right? So let's say I do the experiment, somebody else tries it, and they get radically different results than I do. And they're able to explain maybe some of the errors in my own thinking. Well, then I have to go back to the drawing board. It's not going to work for me to stomp my fist and hold my breath and get all angry about it, right? I simply have to figure out where I went wrong. And epistemologists, philosophers working in epistemology have to do the same thing. If we're trying to get at some question as difficult as the nature of knowledge, it's easy for us to get it wrong. And when we do, we have to be honest about that and go back to our assumptions. Run the thing through again, try to figure out the error of our ways. The counterexample method is part of the philosophical practice of getting closer to an accurate account of a concept. Understanding the process of conceptual analysis is key to following the debate in epistemological theorizing about knowledge and justification. So, if we're going to really get to an answer here, then we have to be able to use these tools like conceptual analysis and counterexamples and argumentation. These are just tools, kind of like the experimental method in science is just a tool to help us get closer to the truth. And the more carefully we apply these tools, the more reasonably we can expect to actually get closer to the truth. Okay? Let me give you an example. I'm not going to read this whole thing. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll give you the gestalt. So this, again, comes from our reading. But let's imagine that I'm sitting in my office. I really wish my office up in CGUS had windows. It doesn't. But let's say for the sake of argument. Say what?
Barely have room to sit.
Barely have room to sit in there. Thanks, Dr. Amos. Actually, I really love our office. It's really a nice place to hang out, but it is tight. But let's say that back in my office, my chiropractic office in Alabama, there was these beautiful windows in rooms 1 and 3. So when I was doing leg checks, those patients, I could look out the window to the parking lot and see all the way down Highway 49, which was right there at the intersection in front of our office. And let's say that I'm there and I'm doing a leg check and I happen to notice this. This is an eastern bluebird out the window. Now, I have reason to believe that what I'm seeing is actually there, that I'm not hallucinating. If I'm hallucinating at work, then I've got a big problem. Okay? But I see a bluebird out my window. Now, do I have good reason to believe that? Sure. I see it. I don't have any reason to doubt my senses, right? Could I be hallucinating? Yeah. Or the so-called bird may be a decoy, a fake stuffed bird. Now, come on. Have you guys seen this like conspiracy theory that birds aren't real? Pigeons aren't real? Is that what it is? The first time I saw this was like a bumper sticker that was on a brick wall in Marietta Square. At first I saw it, I was like, what kind of practical joke is this? Of course birds are real. Right? Birds are real. But let's grant that there is indeed a real bird on the branch, and that, quote, there is a bird on the branch is true right now. Can I say that I know there's a bird on the branch, given that I believe it, it's true, and have good reason to believe it? Okay, well, let's look at this example here a little bit more closely. In this example, we're trying to investigate a claim by another philosopher. let's say a philosopher comes around and they say, well, for you to actually have knowledge about the bird, you have to have certainty. This is what the philosophers are arguing. Okay? So this is somebody else who's sitting down with you and they're saying, yes, if you want to claim knowledge that there's a bird out there, you have to have certainty about it. That's their claim. Fair enough. Okay? Well, then how do we investigate the claim? We go and we do a thought experiment. We say, okay, let's say that there's a bird out there and I see it, okay, but I'm not certain about it. I have my doubts. But I believe that what I'm seeing is true. Okay? Is it possible to believe something but not be certain of it?
Yes.
I would say so. Right? So this is our thought experiment. Okay? So I have reason to believe it, that's justification. I do believe it, even if I'm not absolutely certain. I do believe it. And it's true, there happens to be an actual bird out my window. Having justified a true belief, I can claim knowledge, which means that the certainty that this other philosopher is claiming as necessary for knowledge simply isn't necessary at all. That's our counterexample, that's our argument. Looking at argumentation more clearly, here's an example. Testimonial injustice occurs when the opinions of individuals, groups are unfairly ignored or treated as untrustworthy. If the testimony of women in criminal court cases is less likely to be believed than that of men, then this is unfair. So if the testimony of women in criminal court cases is less likely to be believed than that of men, this is a case of testimonial injustice. It's a simple example of argumentation. And we use argumentation of this nature to try to support or refute the claims that are made about knowledge. We can also use research. Research comes from psychology, sociology, economics, medicine, criminal justice. We even use epistemology and chiropractic. In the social and hard sciences, the goal is to accurately describe trends and phenomena. And this is where philosophy differs from the sciences. For epistemology, the goal is not only to describe, but also to prescribe. Philosophers can argue that unjustifiably discounting the opinions of groups is bad and to be avoided. Hence, epistemology is a normative discipline. Normative. What does that mean? That means it's what we ought to do. Normative means it's what we should all assent to. Epistemology turns out to be normative, which is the assumption that certain actions, beliefs, or other mental states are good and ought to be pursued or realized. So if I were to ask you guys on an exam, quiz, well, what is normative or normativity? It describes those actions or beliefs that we ought to do. They're good for us, they're good for society. They're good for their own sake. Okay? That's the idea. Or you might want to describe it like this. They establish normal relationships between individuals. If we're going to live in a peaceful, civilized society, we have to come up with kind of rules, right? A way of living with one another. That could be normative in that it establishes normal relations between people. One way to think of epistemology is that in describing what knowledge, truth, and justification are, it further prescribes the proper way to form beliefs. How should we form beliefs? I'm going to confess something to you personally about me, based on my experience with social media lately. Here's my confession. I don't believe anything that I see anymore on social media. It's become a pervasive problem for me. Every video, every post. My initial assumption now is that it is deliberately sensationalized, if there's any truth to it at all. Or it is utterly fake. It's either AI generated or it's staged. So I've come to be completely skeptical of everything that I see on social media. I'm not even outraged by anything. If I see some horrible tragedy occur, my initial response is it's either sensationalized, it's AI generated, or it's staged. But what if it's true? Ought I to be outraged if it's true? Of course. But now I have a kind of growing skepticism about everything that I see. That's a problem. So matters of epistemology become immediately important. society. Now, I'm not trying to project my own bias on you guys, but I do notice this in myself, and I perceive it as a problem. How do we know what's true? How do we know what to believe? What's the right way to form a belief in this world as quickly as it's changing? These are extremely important questions. What kind of beliefs are patients forming about chiropractic right now? What's the right way to form a belief? If people are forming beliefs that are inaccurate about our profession, and I see this all the time, in what way are we going to counter those beliefs and help people come closer to the truth as we understand it? How do we form our own beliefs about chiropractic? How do we know that our beliefs are any more true than theirs? Does that make sense? To say that a person knows something directly implies that the person is not wrong. So knowledge implies truth. But knowledge is more than just truth. Knowledge also implies effort. That the person who has knowledge did more than just form a belief. They somehow earned it. Often, in epistemology, this is understood as justification. These features of knowledge are important to keep in mind as we continue. First, we will look at the different ways of knowing. Let's talk about different ways of knowing. Now, we talked about a priori and a posteriori knowledge back in quarter one. So that should be somewhat familiar to you. But just to recap very quickly, a priori knowledge is knowledge before experience, logically prior to experience, or before the fact. Knowledge that exists before experience, prior in time, is called innate knowledge, or knowledge that you're somehow born with. Some philosophers doubt that any such innate knowledge actually exists. In fact, John Locke, one of the famous philosophers of 17th, 18th century, would say that we are a tabula rasa. We're a blank slate. We have no innate knowledge. And everything that we know, we kind of gain through experience. Others would say, no, we're born with a certain degree of instinct or intuitive knowledge. Arthur Schopenhauer was one of these people who argued vehemently with this. So did Immanuel Kant, who we're going to look at in a moment. Okay? But not all philosophers agree that we're born with a certain amount of knowledge. And not all a priori knowledge is prior to experience. We're going to look at an example of that in just a minute. A posteriori knowledge is experiential. You live, you learn. Period. Okay? Gained through experience. It is empirical. Something is empirical if it's based on and verifiable through observation and experience. So all scientific knowledge is a posteriori knowledge. That means you did an experiment, you observed the outcome, and you learned something from it. All street smarts is a posteriori knowledge, if you take it in its purest form. Right? While a priori knowledge does not require experience, it does not mean that it must always be reached using reason alone. A priori knowledge can also be learned through experience. Wait, what? Not to muddy the waters, but consider this. The definition of a priori knowledge is knowledge prior to experience, or known through reason alone. It means you can work it out mentally without having to go out and experience it directly. Does that make sense? Well, then how is it the case that some a priori knowledge can be known after experience? Well, the example they're giving here is math. Once you've done a sufficient amount of basic math, then you can take the rules that you've learned and you can learn new things about math just by reasoning it out yourself. Does that make sense? You don't have to go someplace and experience something. You can just work it out through reason. Does that make sense? But to be able to do that, you had to first learn some basic rules of math, which is experiential. Right? So some a priori concepts, like advanced math, you can only get to by first learning some basic rules of math. But this raises the question, which is kind of a perennial question in philosophy. Did we invent mathematics, or did we discover mathematics? Well, consider the difference here. If math is something that we invent, then math is not something apart from our own brains. It's just something that we construct for ourselves. That's useful. But if math is something we discover, then it's kind of baked into reality itself and exists apart from us. It has very important implications for us. Think of mathematical truths. While it is possible to figure out multiplication using thinking alone, many first understand it empirically by memorizing multiplication tables, and then later come to understand why the operations work the way they do. Like you might memorize in high school something like the quadratic equation, which I'm sure that if I gave you guys some example problems right now, you could just nail it. Quadratic equation. Now you might memorize the quadratic equation and memorize the steps to solve it and get to the right answer, and not have any idea of why the equation works in the first place, or what relationships it represents in the world. Does that make sense? But then after the fact, a posteriori, you do come to understand the reason the equation works the way it does and the kinds of relationships that it represents. This is the interplay between a priori and a posteriori knowledge. Let's talk about propositional knowledge. Philosophers classify knowledge not only by its source, but also by its type. Propositional knowledge is knowledge of propositions or statements, of course. A proposition or statement is a declarative sentence with a truth value. That is, a sentence that is either true or false. If one knows the statement, that means that the statement is true. And true statements about the world are usually called facts. Hence, propositional knowledge is best thought of as knowledge of facts. Propositional knowledge can be a priori or a posteriori. Knowledge of our height is clearly a posteriori because we have to know it. We don't simply know that beforehand. And it changes, right? We get taller, then later in life we start to get a little shorter again. We don't know at any given moment our exact height. We would have to measure it. That's a posteriori. That's the fact. But knowing that 3 is the square root of 9 is a priori, given that it's possible for you to work it out through reason alone. As long as you understand the rules of math, you can get to the answer there without having to go and experience something to prove it true. Yeah. Yes. You know, you're right. You're exactly right. So let me try to clarify it this way. I'll make it as simple as possible. If I had 2 objects, and then I had 3 objects over here on the other side of the table, and I brought all the objects together and I had 5 objects. 2 to the left, 3 to the right, 5 total. That cannot be the only example of 2 plus 3 equals 5. 2 plus 3 equals 5 becomes a kind of relationship that supersedes this one example that I can then apply to any example of the grouping of 2 and 3 anywhere in the universe. Does that make sense? So I don't have to go to the far reaches of the galaxy to prove that 2 plus 3 equals 5. Once I understand the general principle, then through reason alone, I can come to understand things about the relationship of any group of 2 and 3. Does that make sense? Or any derivation of 5, any factor of 5. And that's what a priori is. It's like once you do have those basic rules of reason, then you no longer have to go and experience something directly for it to be true. I no longer have to see 2 groups of 2 objects and a group of 3 objects brought together to form 5. It doesn't require a posteriori knowledge of that. It becomes reason alone. Right? But I think you raise an interesting question, which is, don't you have to have experienced something like bringing 2 and 3 together to make 5 for the principle to make sense? And this gets at the question I raised earlier about whether math is something that we discover or whether it's something that we create for ourselves. And that's an open question in philosophy. And this came to a head between two groups of philosophers in the 1700s, the rationalists on one hand and the empiricists on the other. And the way that they really fought this out is one of the great sources of inspiration in Western philosophy. And we can talk about this more, but for the sake of a very basic conversation, we're trying to keep them in different groups and say that a priori knowledge is knowledge learned just simply by the concepts alone. If you know the word bachelor means, and I'm very bad, you never have to meet a bachelor to know that that's what that word means. Does that make sense? That'd be a priori. Now, if you happen to meet someone who is a bachelor, well, that affirms by experience what you already knew conceptually to be the case. That bachelor means unmarried man, right? If you've never met an astronaut, but you know that an astronaut has a particular definition, right? You don't ever have to meet one to know that that's what the word means. Right? Let me give you another example that might help. Let's talk about procedural knowledge. If you know the mechanics of how to ride a bike, but you've never ridden one, can you say that you really know how to ride a bike? And I think intuitively we all start shaking our head like, for those of us who've ridden a bike, we realize it takes a lot more than just conceptually understanding the mechanics of how to work the machine. It takes a certain coordinating with ourselves to be able to maintain balance on the bicycle and not wreck, right? So there's a distinction to be made between procedural knowledge, how to actually do something, and sort of conceptual knowledge about how the thing is done. The same can be true of any art, right? Think about the art of chiropractic, of the adjustment. Now, a layperson in just a few minutes can understand the basic mechanics of how to move a bone. You find the misalignment, you line it up along a line of drive, that means a vector force, and by the application of movement of your body and strength of your muscles, quick, artful thrust, you're able to replace the misaligned bone into its proper alignment. I've just given you all the mechanical analysis a priori of how to effectively adjust this. Does that mean that you're ready to hold someone's head in your hand and move a bone? No. There's a difference between procedural knowledge, the how-to, and conceptual knowledge, right? There's also knowledge by acquaintance, and I think this also gets to what we're talking about. Knowledge by acquaintance is being there in the world, experiencing it for yourself. Okay? A person knows something by acquaintance when they are directly aware of that thing. It comes from direct perception using your senses. For example, I have knowledge by acquaintance of pain when I am in pain. I'm directly aware of the pain. I cannot be mistaken about the existence of that pain. This is one of the real mysteries of clinical practice. When patients come into your office with neck pain, low back pain, or whatever the pain might be, it's very real to them, but it's not anything that we can experience directly. I cannot have knowledge by acquaintance of my patient's pain. I have to take that on their testimony. I have to rely on the truthfulness of their testimony. But that has to get factored into my clinical awareness and understanding of the patient's condition. And it forms my judgments about how best to manage the case. We're going to talk about that at the end of this lecture as well. But this is knowledge by acquaintance. Now, Bertrand Russell was one of the great philosophers and mathematicians of the 20th century. And he thought very carefully about this definition of knowledge by acquaintance. This distinction between acquaintance and propositional knowledge that might be known beforehand. Kind of the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. And here's what he said. Knowledge by acquaintance is a direct form of knowledge. A person has knowledge by acquaintance when they have direct cognitive awareness of it, which is awareness absent of interference. Does that sound like chiropractic? Right? I have direct experience of something without interference. That seems like exactly what we're trying to do with everything in chiropractic. Remove the interference. All knowledge by acquaintance is a posteriori, but not all a posteriori knowledge is knowledge by acquaintance. My awareness of pain is knowledge by acquaintance. Yet, when I infer that, quote, something is causing me pain, this belief is propositional. So, wait, what? Like, what is he trying to say? here's the easiest way that I know to explain this. When you are in a moment experiencing something directly, like me talking to you, are you experiencing it directly by acquaintance? Or can you only be acquainted with your senses and the representation given to you by your senses? Think about this, right? The distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and propositional knowledge, if accurate, has very important implications. It shows that inference is used even in cases of belief that people think are obvious, ordinary beliefs based on perception. Take again the example of the bluebird outside my window. Am I actually seeing the bird itself? Or am I only aware of the representations that my senses are providing? The sight, the sound, if there were a smell, touch. Am I actually seeing the bird? Am I experiencing the world directly, or am I only, the only knowledge of acquaintance that I have is the knowledge of my own senses? That's the question that Russell is trying to raise. And this is what he means earlier when he's talking about knowledge by description. Sense data are sensations gained from perceptual experience. They are the raw data obtained from the senses. One's perceptual experience of sense data, not of objects that could be causing that sense data, raises the question about what we're actually experiencing in the world. Are we seeing the world as it is? Or are we just experiencing our own senses? People infer the existence of external objects that they believe cause their perceptual experiences. Russell's view implies that people always use reasoning to access the external world. I have knowledge by acquaintance of my perceptual experience of seeing a bird. I can infer ever so quickly that there is a bird on the branch with propositional knowledge. So again, I'm in my office. I'm doing a leg check. There's a beautiful bluebird that rests on a branch just outside the window, and I can hear it singing, and I see it. The sun gleaming off its feathers. All that I really have access to are my senses, the sights, the sounds that are given to my mind. But then I infer that there must be something out there in the world that's giving my senses this data. Does that make sense? But that inference is propositional knowledge. It's an inference alone. That's it. The only thing that I can be directly acquainted with is what's given to me by my senses. So it means there's always going to be a little bit of detachment between myself and the world. Not all philosophers think that experience of the external world is mediated through sense data. Some philosophers contend that people can directly perceive objects in the external world. Some people will say, stop it, this is ridiculous. Your senses are not lying to you. If you see a bird, it's because there's a bird. If you hear it, it's because it's there. And other philosophers would say, no. All we can ever be sure of is that my brain is constructing an idea based on the senses. So the only thing that I actually have access to are my senses. It says nothing about whether there's actually a bird out there. And most of us have been fooled before. Go back to what I said earlier about social media. Have any of you been fooled by AI videos? If you've never been fooled, you're a better person than me. I really try hard to try to see through AI-generated images. I'm telling you, it's getting harder and harder all the time.
Well, actually, like the hands.
Yeah, the hands, they've gotten better about this. It used to be there were like 6, 7 digits on one hand. Now, it's getting a little bit better and better. But yeah, that used to be a pretty easy tell. And there was a kind of softness to AI-generated images, but now they're getting sharper, more refined. AI is even starting to put subtle asymmetries into things to give them a greater sense of realism. It's getting creepy. Yeah.
Are hallucinations like you said, but they be the same senses, we think of them as senses, and some people are like, I knew it was there, but
Yeah, and that's exactly what this whole thought process is getting at, which is if I see you sitting here, we're having this conversation, am I actually seeing and perceiving you as you are in the world? Or am I just responding to what my senses are providing to me, the representation of you in my brain? And how do I know that the representation of my brain is accurate to who and what you are in the world? And this is where, again, some philosophers would say, look, you're fooling yourself. Just stop with all the overthinking. You can trust your senses. They're accurate. And other philosophers would say, don't be so sure. You've been fooled before.
Would that then say that you will never know a single thing that you already know?
Well, that's exactly what Immanuel Kant proposed in his work. And that's why I have this picture of him here. Kant said that there is phenomena. That means the world as it appears to us in our senses. And then there's the world as it actually is outside of our brains, which he called the noumena. And Kant's argument was we will never know the noumena. We can only ever know the phenomenon, the way it's presented to our brains.
That was a what was that being as if the world itself, but it's a part of the world.
We infer that it is. We infer that there's something out there in the world that's giving to our senses this data, which is why we have the perception in the first place. But we can't know what the world is actually like in itself, according to Kant. Now, there are philosophers who argue against this, of course, but that's just one view. And this is all part of what it means to think about knowledge. What can we actually know? Well, hang on to that, because we'll talk about skepticism. Okay. The potential gap, that there is a gap between one's experience of the world and the world itself, opens up a possibility of error. The gap between experience and the world is used by some thinkers to argue that knowledge of the external world is impossible. To your point, if there is this gap between our representation of the world and the world as it actually is, then is it possible for us to ever have knowledge? That's the question that it raises. Okay. Hold on to that. A person may say things like, well, that's just their truth, as if something can be true for one person and not for others. Yet, for statements and propositions, there is only one truth. I mean, the example they give here is kind of comical. Someone might believe that the earth is flat. Another person might believe that it's round. The trouble is, only one of them is correct. I've heard it said that everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but no one is entitled to their own facts. Facts are just statements of what is the case, how things actually are. But you see how that becomes problematic based on our earlier conversation. How do we know how things actually are? All we know is what is filtered through our senses, given to us in our perceptions. How do we know that my perceptions are the same as yours? How do we ever reach any agreement on things? How does language even work, if that's the case? These are all really important philosophical questions. Okay? One person can believe the earth is flat while another believes it's round, but only one of them is right. People do not each personally get to decide whether a statement is true. Just because one has no way of determining whether a statement is true or false does not mean that there's not truth to the matter. It gets a little more difficult before it gets easier, unfortunately. What does it mean for a statement to be true? At first, the question may seem silly. The meaning of truth is obvious. True things are correct. They're factual. They're accurate. But to say that something is correct and factual and accurate is just another way of saying it's true. That creates a vicious cycle. Remember our conversation earlier about the coherence theory of truth, the correspondence theory of truth, the pragmatist theory of truth. This is how we try to break that cycle. Do you guys remember us talking about this? Yeah. So some philosophers would say, well, to kind of break out of this nonsense, we can go back to basic definitions of truth. If truth is that which corresponds with reality, right, then we can sort of break out of this and say, we just need to get closer to what corresponds with reality. How do we know reality in itself? Now we're back to this. Right? These are, again, some of the more difficult or pernicious questions in philosophy. Plato gave a definition of justified true belief. He said, P is true. P can stand for proposition. S is subject. The subject believes that P, the proposition, and the subject is justified in believing P. So as long as they have justification, belief, and truth, then they have knowledge. This is what Plato offered. This is what Aristotle championed throughout his life. And this held sway for 2,000 years. Barnes' hypothesis on knowledge, often referred to as the JTB account, justified true belief, is highly intuitive. It makes sense to us experientially. If I have good reason to believe something, it's justified. If it's true, that means it corresponds with reality. And if I believe it, given the other conditions, then I can claim knowledge. This is what Plato said. But there's a problem. I mentioned Gettier earlier. Edmund Gettier, in 1963, published a short paper titled, "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?" What I love about this paper is it's only about a page and a half long. It's an extremely short research paper, especially for a philosopher. And it upended over 2,000 years of epistemology. It was an absolute scandal. I love it. Gettier presents two counterexamples to Plato's analysis of knowledge. In these counterexamples, a person seems to have justified true belief, yet they do not seem to have knowledge. Let me give you Gettier's famous example from his own paper, then I'll offer you the fake barn country example, which is a little easier to imagine. Let's take two characters, Smith and Jones. Okay? Two characters, Smith and Jones. They're both up for a job. That means they're both going in applying for the same job. Okay? And let's say that on the way to applying for the job, Smith happens to see Jones buy something from a vending machine. And Smith happens to notice that Jones has exactly 10 coins in change that Jones puts in Jones' pocket. And then later on, Smith overhears the president of the company say that Jones is going to get the job. You with me so far? So then Smith forms the belief that the person who's going to get the job has got 10 coins in their pocket. Now, is that reasonable? Does Smith have justification for that belief? Would you say so? Does Smith have good reason to believe that whoever gets the job has 10 coins in their pocket? Of course, he just heard the boss say that Jones is going to get the job. And he saw earlier that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. So it's perfectly justifiable for Smith to say that the person who's going to get the job has got 10 coins in his pocket. You can almost hear him saying this. But here's what happens. When the manager comes out, it's actually Smith who gets the job. And as it turns out, Smith also happens to have 10 coins in his pocket. Well, this raises a problem for us in epistemology because the earlier belief that Smith had, that the person who was going to get the job had 10 coins in their pocket, was true all along. He had justification for the belief. He did believe it, and it was true. The only problem is we can't claim it as knowledge because who Smith thought was going to get the job, Jones, didn't get the job at all. It was actually Smith who got the job. So we have all of the components of Plato's knowledge. We have justification, we have truth, we have belief, but it's not knowledge. Something's missing. But what? It's a page and a half long. Gettier showed conclusively that you can still have justification, truth, and belief and not have knowledge. There's something missing. But he didn't explain the missing variable, which remains a problem for us today. The fake barn country example is even easier. Let's say that you're driving around in the outskirts of Los Angeles, in some suburb of LA. And you finally get out into something that looks like rural countryside, okay? And as you drive along, you start seeing all these barns. No big deal. You're out in the country. You expect there to be barns. And you look out upon one particular barn and you say, hey man, that's a really nice barn out there. What you don't realize is that all the barns that you've seen up to this point have been fake. It's all part of a big movie set they've set up outside of LA. But the one barn that you happen to choose just now to make that statement, to form that belief, is the only actual barn that's out there. Sounds unbelievable, right? Well, stranger things have happened. So you have justification. It is true that that's a barn, and you believe it. The problem is that you're not aware of all of the other factors that come into play in that statement. You don't have knowledge of what's actually going on. That's another example of the Gettier problem. Yeah.
That seems like a regular definition of knowledge, right? There's like knowledge would be, to me, would be like a base definition. And what's knowledge as far as the true base definition? But I feel like you have knowledge of some type of definition of something.
And that's what a lot of philosophers argue too. They're saying you can have real knowledge without being, to your point, omniscient, without having all of the knowledge of the whole universe. Would you have to have all of the knowledge of the universe, a sort of godlike knowledge, to ever claim, quote, real or true knowledge on Gettier's point? Right? Maybe we don't have to have that. Maybe justification by itself is sufficient along with truth and belief. But that's what this kind of thing raises. Now, as for us as chiropractors, think about the beliefs that we have. If I provide an adjusting thrust, the patient will heal. Well, that's no different, let's say, than a medical doctor saying if I prescribe the right medication, the patient will heal. The patient does heal. Do they have justification for the belief? Sure they do. And it's backed by what? Peer-reviewed, double-blinded clinical trials. And the patient does, in fact, get better. But let's say they actually got better because of rest and hydration. Turns out that they had a viral infection, not a bacterial. So even though they took the antibiotics, their healing had nothing to do with the treatment. Is this a form of the Gettier problem? Yeah.
Do you use that as a chiropractor with the Jones case sort of, that we know based on countless observations and scientific experiments that there's bones in the body, the way the bones are placed, but we as chiropractors never get to see like our patients real bones. Would that kind of fall into it a little bit?
It might fall into it, but it would be more like the placebo effect. Remember we talked about contextually the recovery last quarter at the end of last quarter? It's kind of like that. Is it the patient? We have this belief that if I administer care to this patient, they're going to heal, and we do, and the patient does heal. But are they healing for the reason that we believe they're healing? And if we are wrong, we don't actually have knowledge of the healing process. That could be an example of Gettier problem. I like this one. When I talk to philosophers on Zoom, my screen background is an exact replica of my actual background, just so I can trick them into having a justified true belief that is not actually knowledge. Classic. Yeah, I do. I actually do stuff like that. The traditional analysis of knowledge explains that knowledge is justified true belief. That's exactly what we've been talking about. That's the traditional intuitive understanding of knowledge. But even if we accept this definition, we can still wonder whether a true belief is knowledge, because we may wonder if it is justified. What counts as justification? Justification makes a belief more likely to be true by providing reasons in favor of the truth of that belief, but it doesn't guarantee that it's true. For instance, a medical doctor is going to prescribe medication to a patient who has a certain set of symptoms and signs. Makes sense. Are they justified in doing it? I would say so. What gives them that justification? Anecdotal experience. Have dealt with these kinds of cases before successfully. Not only that, they have peer-reviewed clinical trials. Right? Do they have good reason to believe that this is going to be true? If yes, then they have justification. Think about the chiropractor. If the chiropractor says, I have a patient here with a condition, a subluxation, I'm going to provide an adjusted thrust to bring it up or facilitate healing in their body. Do they have justification for that belief? Again, they have anecdotal experience, they've dealt with this before successfully, and they also have clinical research to back up their claim. That's justification. But does it guarantee it to be true? The answer is no. It does not guarantee that their belief is true. It just means they have good reason to believe it. That's all. Okay? Theories of justification can be divided into two types, internal and external. And this gets us back to what we said earlier about rationalism and empiricism. A priori versus a posteriori. Okay? Internalism is the idea that through reasoning alone, through cognitive access to the reasons for belief, we can be justified. The subject must be able to immediately, or upon careful reflection, recall their reasons. So it would be like saying, all right, doctor, all right, chiropractor, what reason do you have to believe that the suggesting thrust is going to bring about healing? And the person would say, through my own understanding of anatomy and physiology. That's it. It's by reason alone. It's a priori. That's the internalist idea. What's the externalist idea? The externalist idea would be, no, something in the world provides good evidence to support my belief. It's not through my own understanding, it's through the external observations that are made in the world, that exist in the world. Think about an X-ray. If you take an X-ray, now you have some external justifications for your belief. Does that make sense? You can see the rotated vertebrae. You can see the wedging. You can see the displacement. You can measure it in millimeters. That's externalism. Okay? Externalism is the view that at least some part of justification can rely on factors that are not internal or accessible to the mind of the believer. Foundationalism is the view that all justified beliefs ultimately rest on a set of foundational basic beliefs. So the foundationalist might say, yeah, doctor, you've got an X-ray. You showed me the misplaced vertebrae. Fine. But you're still resting your understanding on the foundation of beliefs that you have about the relationship between the vertebrae and healing. So show me as many X-rays as you want, but you're already assuming that there's some connection between the displacement of the vertebrae and human health. That's foundationalism. Coherentism is like the coherentist theory of truth. It says that justification and knowledge is structured not like a house built on a foundation, but more like a web. More precisely, coherentism argues that a belief is justified if it is embedded in a network of coherent, mutually supporting beliefs, just like the coherentist theory of truth. It's like saying this. Don't begin with a foundation of assumptions. Look at all of the beliefs that are attached to it. That the rotated vertebrae impacts the nervous system, that the nervous system actually modulates immune function, and that the patient's infection is tied to all of these other truths. And adjusting, that means providing a thrust to realign the vertebrae, to take pressure off the nerves, to regulate the immune system is going to bring about healing. We don't need to see an X-ray or know anything else. We just have to know that all those beliefs are coherent, that they work together. That's the coherentist theory. And the sources of beliefs are varied. Just because something results in belief doesn't mean that belief is justified. Think about this. And a lot of people will use this against religion. I'm not trying to do that in this class, but consider this. If somebody comes to believe something based on deep intuition without any kind of external support, they just have a feeling. Can we discredit that completely? Should that count as knowledge? These are the questions that epistemology raises. What kind of credence can we lend to beliefs that are based on faith? And this is a person of faith asking you these questions. Yes?
I actually have trouble with that because in science we learn to state a question and make a hypothesis and do an experiment. And then for religion or spiritual paths, I believe we do exactly the same. We just ask a question, create a hypothesis, I believe, I don't believe, and then go through a series of methodology to experience that certain way of relating or connecting to source. But then science denies that possibility.
That's a good point to raise. And again, my only object in responding is to sort of clarify the nature of debate. I'm not trying to sway you one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, my experience has been with, let's say, atheists are debating the issue of whether God exists. They're not necessarily attacking someone's own intuitions about God, although that does occur. They're more attacking specific claims that are made by religious people or religions specifically. Right? A good example might be that Jesus' first miracle to turn water into wine. And the scientists might rightly argue, well, how is that even physically possible? Right? And then the person of faith might say, well, we don't have to understand it materially. We can understand it by faith, which leaves the scientists infuriated because they have to have some kind of mechanistic cause and effect relationship to go and turn water into wine. It can't just be because somebody says that.
I understand, but like that specific example, as many others in the Bible, are talking about a certain person experience of their own religion towards the divine.
Mhm.
But what I'm trying to talk about is one's personal experience. Like that's not like
Yeah, that's
you
not
know.
up for observation, right? So like your own experience of faith and my own experience of faith is not something that can be scrutinized scientifically. There's no experiment that you could run that could reproduce my own experience of faith, as far as I know. But it's very real to me and guides my life. And it really gets at whether science as a tool is the only path to knowledge. I don't think so. I don't think that science by itself is the only path to real knowledge. But that's an epistemological statement, which is why we're studying this whole topic. Right? I mean, we're not studying it simply based on my own bias about religion. But what I am saying is that we have to take seriously the idea that there are multiple paths to knowledge. And if the only pathway to real knowledge is through science, then that also requires a pretty extraordinary argument, wouldn't it? Of course. And the same thing is true of chiropractic. If somebody wanted to argue against chiropractic, the chiropractic doesn't work because there's no good science behind it. Well, there's two problems with that statement. The first is the claim that there's not good science. There is. Plenty of it, actually. Okay? And you can't prove a negative. Right? The burden of responsibility would be on me to provide the evidence, which I would be more than happy to do. The second problem with this claim is that it implies that science is the only way to real knowledge. That's not necessarily the case. There could be other ways to get to real knowledge besides the scientific method. Right? Again, it's one of the reasons we study this. Memory is another source that we can rely on. Right? Science is extremely valuable because it appeals to our immediate experience. It's that knowledge by acquaintance. Faith, belief, is another way that we might acquire a kind of knowledge. Memory is something that we draw upon to derive knowledge. Inference, when you use reason to come to belief, that's another way that we arrive at belief. The justification you have is inferential. Inferential justification is equivalent to logical justification. But as discussed in the chapter on logic, not all forms of inference can guarantee truth. Inductive reasoning, which is like science, which is very common, is only probable even when it's done well. That means if you were to rely on science, per the conversation we were having, science cannot guarantee that something you're experiencing is true. At best, it can only make it highly likely. Testimony and perception are another way that we can arrive at belief. But again, testimony is only going to be as good as the reliability of the witness. Perception is also another great way that we arrive at belief as a source of justification. But our perceptions could also be wrong. We could also be mistaken. I mentioned skepticism early on. We talked about this last week as well. And we said that global skepticism or total skepticism is a fallacy. In fact, it can be extremely dangerous. And it's also self-refuting. Global skeptics reject the possibility of knowledge in general.
Yeah.
So a global skeptic would say something like, knowledge is impossible to attain. Well, if you claim to have that knowledge, then you're self-refuting. You're arguing against yourself. If you claim that you have knowledge of the fact, quote unquote, that knowledge is impossible to attain, then you're cutting the legs out from underneath. Does that make sense? There would have to be at least one proposition for which you have true knowledge, and that is that knowledge is impossible to attain, which is a contradiction. Does that make sense? So global skepticism seems to fail by its own definition. Local skeptics, however, question the possibility of knowledge only in particular areas of study. So if someone is an agnostic, they might say, maybe there is a God, maybe there's not, but we can't know what that is. As opposed to an atheist that would say there's no possible way that God exists, period. Some apologists would say that true atheism, so-called, is a kind of faith, because it can't be proven. But agnosticism is a kind of local skepticism about the nature of God. So here's some arguments for skepticism. I've already done a pretty good job of showing you the doubts that I have about skepticism. Here's some arguments in favor of skepticism. The dream argument. How do we know that everything we're experiencing right now is not some dream that we're having? That at some point we're going to wake up from this crazy, lucid dream and then have to account for all of the experiences that we've had? That's false. Is that possible? What if when we die, our death is actually an awakening out of the dream into reality? Similar to that might be something like Hilary Putnam's brain in a vat argument, which is what this is supposed to be. Hilary Putnam was a very famous philosopher. He said, what if everything you're experiencing right now is not a dream, but it's like the Matrix? What you actually are is just a brain floating in a vat, and all of your experiences are just perceptions that are given to you by a computer.
Brain is still material.
Like the Matrix. How do we know we're not living in the Matrix? Well, we don't. Well, that's one of the arguments in favor of skepticism. Okay. And the evil demon argument is like the one that we get from Descartes, which we talked about last quarter. What if some demiurge, some demon, were to confront you and to get you to believe that everything you've experienced in life is false? How would you argue against that? It seems like it'd be pretty difficult. Is there any such thing that you could get down to that even the demon would have to admit is true? This is what Descartes tried to do. It was a radical kind of skepticism that Descartes brought to his own thinking. So skepticism can be helpful to us in some ways because it forces us to think about justification. What reason do I have to believe what's given to me by my senses? If I cannot rule out the possibility of SH, then I cannot be justified in believing that P. I cannot rule out the possibility of SH. Therefore, I cannot be justified in believing that P. This is the basic idea of skepticism. The only question is, how far do you want your skepticism to go? Again, if you adopt the global skepticism, then you doubt that any knowledge is possible, which can be self-refuting. But if you adopt a local skepticism, then you doubt knowledge about particular things. This is where it begins to affect us as doctors. Contextualism is the view that truth of knowledge attributions depend on context. Contextualism is a theory about knowledge and justification. When we attribute knowledge to a subject, S, the truth of the knowledge claim depends on the context that S is in. The context of S determines the level of justification needed for a true belief to count as knowledge. It comes from the observation that the level of confidence needed for justification changes depending on what the belief is, as well as its purpose and its importance, among other things. We expect a high degree of justification from physicians when they diagnose disease, but less justification from friends recalling the title of a movie, because there's much more at stake in medical diagnosis. Context really matters. If I say that I know something, doesn't the context matter? Last night, I was up with my daughter, Willow. She and I were having this wonderful conversation about movies that we like and plot. And she very quickly rattled off the plot to the movie The Outsiders. She's read the book, she's seen the movie, she loves it. And I was impressed with how well she could recall some of the details of the plot and the order that she remembered it in. Very impressive. But then she asked me what my favorite movie was, and I started to recount some of the plot from one of my favorite movies, which is Back to the Future. Now there are 3 of those movies, and the plot is very complicated. And as I stand here in front of you, I didn't get it exactly right. My memory is flawed. Is that okay? Sure. What do we have to lose? What are the stakes? So I get the plot a little mixed up. To go back and correct it. No harm, no foul. Could we say the same thing if I were with a patient? If I did a history, a physical exam, and I arrived at a diagnosis, the context really matters in this case. What justification I have for the beliefs that I form about the patient matter because the stakes are higher. This is what contextualism is trying to convey. What clinicians, biomedical scientists, and other healthcare professionals know as individuals or as groups, and how they come to know and use knowledge are central concerns of medical epistemology. Now, don't be scared off by the word medical epistemology. It applies to us as chiropractors as well. We have a kind of medical or chiropractic epistemology, which is the justification that we have for the beliefs that we form as a profession and how they align with the truth, the facts about things. You can think of this as a chiropractic epistemology. Activities associated with knowledge production and use are called epistemic practices. Chiropractors have epistemic practices. What are some of those? Like, what are some of the epistemic practices of chiropractors? Can you think of any? Is reading research a kind of epistemic practice for chiropractors? Absolutely. Is the analysis that we do with our various techniques a kind of epistemic practice? Even the history and the physical exam are kinds of epistemic practices for chiropractors. But it's the way that we form beliefs. It's the justification behind our beliefs. Such practices are considered in biomedical and clinical literature, social science of medicine, philosophy of science, and even non-medical literature. The understanding of medical or even chiropractic epistemology focused on what kinds of medical knowledge are relevant to clinical decisions. Are all forms of knowledge relevant to making a diagnosis about a patient? We talked about a variety of different forms of knowledge. We talked about things like the scientific method of induction, a priori, a posteriori, foundationalism. We talked about coherentism. Are all forms of knowledge relevant to making a diagnosis? And if the answer is yes, how do we ensure that we've used all forms of knowledge every time we make a diagnosis? That seems like an impossible task. But if not all forms of knowledge are relevant, then we are confronted with a different problem, which is which ones are relevant and why? Why not others? Right? Understanding the meaning of the term evidence is one of the fundamental tasks of medical epistemology. What counts as good evidence? Other foundations of the evidence-based medicine movement, such as the hierarchy of evidence and the concept of best evidence, rest on epistemological assertions, claims regarding the appropriate kind and relative value of knowledge in medicine. So before we end today, consider this. One of the chief responsibilities of all doctors, including chiropractors, is to receive patients under our care, find out whatever we can about them. That means gather evidence. Use that evidence as justification for the beliefs that we form about this person, and then let those beliefs guide us in the decisions that we make about this person's care. It's a huge responsibility, yeah? Well, the question that we've been getting at in this entire discussion is, what is knowledge? How do we know it? What counts as knowledge? How do we form beliefs in an appropriate way? How do we let those beliefs guide us in a responsible fashion in assisting other people in our offices? Epistemology has a real important role to play in our thinking as doctors. And as we continue along in this class, I hope that you begin to reflect and really sort of ruminate on the role of epistemology in your practice, in your development as students. So, for next week, please review section 5.4, Introduction to Philosophy. This is pages 150 and 158. Okay? Fallacies of